Welcome to the NDIS Property Australia podcast. Before starting this episode, we need to provide a general disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast is general in nature only. It does not take into account the objectives, financial situation, or needs of any particular person. You need to consider your financial situation and needs before making any decisions based on the information in this podcast. And you should consider seeking independent and professional advice for your personal circumstances. All right, let's begin. So welcome everybody to another episode of the NDIS Property Australia podcast. This is Emelitta from the office, and today I'm here with Andrew Gilles. Andrew is the National Policy Manager at MS Australia. Hi, Andrew.
Hi there.
So, Andrew, do you want to start off by introducing yourself a bit further, explaining who you are, what you do?
Sure. So, my role here at MS Australia is National Policy Manager, and MS Australia is a big not-for-profit organisation that provides a voice and acts as a champion for Australia's MS community. And there's about 25,600 people living with MS in Australia, plus their partners and family members and friends and carers. So you could probably multiply that by 5 or 6 and get an idea of the number of people affected by MS in Australia. MS Australia operates with a federated model of organisations. So some of the people listening to this podcast will be probably more familiar with the big MS organisations in each state, and they provide services and support to the MS community and also conduct a lot of fundraising. Mm-hmm. As the national peak body, we have 2 main functions. One of them is to coordinate MS-related research across Australia. So that's fundraising for research, and then through a series of grant rounds, providing funding to the big universities and medical research institutes around Australia for MS-focused research. Mm-hmm. And the other work that I'm involved in is systemic advocacy. So if you have a problem with your NDIS package, I probably can't help you. You would need to ring whichever state organisation based on where you live. But if you wanted to influence changes to the NDIS, then you would give me a ring. We write submissions, we meet with ministers, we try to influence the future, for example, of the NDIS, but also a whole range of other activities that affect the lives of people with MS.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that introduction. There's going to be some people who are listening to this podcast who aren't really familiar with what MS, multiple sclerosis is. So I suppose going back a little bit and, explaining that, just an overview of maybe what MS is and maybe some of the different forms of MS.
Sure. So multiple sclerosis is a progressive degenerative neurological condition, and it affects mostly young adults. Most people are between the ages of 20 and 40 when they're diagnosed. 75% of the MS population in Australia and worldwide are women. We don't know what it's amazing. We don't know what the cause is, but researchers are getting closer to determining a cause. And at the moment, the research thinking is that it's some kind of combination between genetic and environmental factors. And what actually happens with multiple sclerosis and why it's called multiple sclerosis is that, in short, the body's own immune system makes a mistake and it attacks and damages the fatty material, which is called myelin, that we all have around our nerves. And the myelin is there because it protects and insulates the nerves, a bit like the plastic around electricity wires, so that when our brain sends messages out to the rest of our body, the myelin makes sure that these messages travel efficiently. And if a person's having an MS attack, or we sometimes call it an exacerbation, that myelin has broken down. And often it has broken down in multiple places around your body. And so this demyelination causes parts of the nervous system to become exposed, and then the messages get leaked out. And it's the leaking of those messages that causes people's symptoms. So it might be trouble with walking. It might be issues with continence. It might be numbness and tingling in your fingers or feet. There's another symptom called foot drop. People complain of neuropathic pain, and fatigue is one of the most common. So this leaking out of messages around our nervous system is exhausting for our bodies. And so people with MS, nearly everybody I know, experiences incredible fatigue.
Wow.
And at this stage, there's no cure for MS. There are some clues, and organisations like ours would probably argue that we are getting closer and closer because we know more and more about MS. And there are a number of drugs that people can take. I think there's now 15 drugs available in Australia, subsidised on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme for people living with MS. These are very powerful drugs, and most of them are to suppress people's immune systems.
Wow.
So that these mistaken, so the body's own mistaken attacking of itself through the immune system is suppressed. But of course that has side effects, and of course was a big issue for us during COVID, because if your body's being attacked by a virus, you want your immune system to be tip-top.
Absolutely.
If you're taking an immune-suppressing drug to suppress your immune system, it makes you more vulnerable then to situations like COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. And thank you so much for that explanation. It's an amazing explanation. It really, for people who didn't understand what it is, it gives a great understanding. You mentioned that MS Australia is really working towards finding a cure for MS, and that there's 25,600 people within Australia that have MS. And I read on these fact sheets 2.8 million people worldwide living with MS. So what can be done towards helping find a cure?
So there's all sorts of possibilities. So, of course, medications can help people. So the faster you can get diagnosed, the faster your disease course will be modified. So if you're experiencing symptoms, often people have trouble with their vision initially, so double vision. So sometimes it's an optometrist who says, oh, well, you need to go and see a neurologist and be tested. Sometimes it's tingling, sometimes it's numbness, sometimes it's balance, sometimes difficulty speaking. So MS at the point of diagnosis is often confused with all sorts of other, conditions. Are you having a stroke? Have you got some other kind of nerve damage? Have you got some problem with your optic nerve? But the faster you can get diagnosed, usually through having an MRI, because the sclerosis, which is the Greek word, for any Greek listeners, the Greek word for scarring or scars. So multiple scars is the English translation, if you like, of multiple sclerosis. So it means many scars in your nervous system. They will show up on an MRI as little white patches. And depending on how big they are and how many there are, will determine what kind of treatment course you need. So as well as the drugs, there's people who respond well to stem cell transplant treatment, which is quite I shouldn't say extreme, but quite a full-on treatment where you the hematologist, the doctors will take out some of your stem cells. They'll then knock out your immune system through a lethal dose of chemotherapy. Then they'll re-inject those stem cells into your body to kickstart it again. Not a cure, but it's a dampening of the impact of multiple sclerosis. Some people respond really well, some people not so well, depending on how long they've been diagnosed for. Other people manage their MS through big lifestyle changes. So I'm not going to tell you anything new here. Lots of exercise, lots of good eating habits. So leafy green vegetables, very important. A lot of people go onto a pescatarian diet to manage their MS. Keep away from the fats, keep away from the sugar. Monitor your alcohol intake. A lot of people just stop drinking, but I guess that's sometimes hard. So really cut back on alcohol. Obviously smoking. Don't smoke if you've got MS. You're just making your body have to do an awful lot more. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people find benefit from all of those de-stressing activities. Stress, like a lot of diseases and conditions, is really bad for MS. So lots of yoga and meditation and Pilates and long walks along the beach with your dog and all of those things really, really help. I know a few people with MS who've managed their symptoms and who don't take any drugs at all, and they're aging quite well. But for other people, depending on how the disease has affected them, they are dependent on services and support and medications, and it's very unpredictable, so which is often quite scary for people living with MS. They're just not sure if they'll have a flare-up or an exacerbation next week, but people get used to it and are able to manage it. But when you're a young woman between 20 and 30 and you get this diagnosis when you're thinking about a family or study or work, it's pretty devastating.
Absolutely. Wow. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for explaining that. So when it comes to the NDIS, where do you think the NDIS sits in this? How can the NDIS really help benefit someone that's living with multiple sclerosis' life?
Yeah. So around 25,600 people with MS in Australia. At the moment, according to the NDIA quarterly reports, we think there's up to about 10,000 people with some kind of NDIS package, small or large. So you can see that, well, not quite half, maybe a third, and maybe our prevalence numbers, like that 25,600 was determined in 2018, there's probably more now. So let's say approximately a third of the MS population in Australia have got NDIS packages. Mm-hmm. And some people are, and I remember you earlier asking me about the forms of MS. So most people get relapsing remitting MS. So best way to simply describe that is that you've always got it, it never goes away, but the effects can come and go, and you can go through long periods where you plateau. After some years, it varies, say 10 or 15, you can move into the secondary progressive form of MS. You probably in that phase you won't have big flare-ups or exacerbations, but your disability will progress. There are other people, about 10% of the population of people with MS, who are diagnosed with the progressive form. It's called primary progressive MS on day one. That is a steady decline. There are no drugs or treatment for that form of MS. Those people are in real need of support, possibly through NDIS packages. Mm-hmm. You don't automatically get an NDIS package if you've got MS. We're not in the category like motor neurone diseases, for example, where you automatically get a package. We keep arguing for that at least people should be able to be registered with the NDIS before they turn 65. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't happen automatically. You still have to meet the hurdle requirements of functional impairment.
Right.
There's a bit of a kind of a catch-22 there, that a lot of the medications and the lifestyle changes are keeping people living at home quite well beyond age 65. Well, if you turn 65 years and one day, you can't get an NDIS package. You have to then deal with your progression of disease through the aged care sector, which is capped and means tested, unlike the NDIS. So we raise this with government and with the ministers from time to time to say, well, the aged care system and the NDIS are inequitable. Mm-hmm. kind of like we're doing our best working with the medicos at one end to try and keep people well for longer, but then when they do need the support later in life in particular, well, they have to get it through the aged care system, which is really designed for frailty and for people with dementia, for example. It's not really addressing the disability needs of people so much. So that's a kind of ongoing argument for us. But the NDIS is a very symbolic way for Australia to be looking after its disability community, and so we advocate heavily for improvements all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So we weren't very happy about the introduction of independent assessments because we believe that people with MS need to be able to rely on their medical team's reports and their therapists' reports, and so we feel that is of more value to assessing somebody with MS than some independent assessment. And we still have to keep on educating NDIA and other public servant staff about MS because it is a difficult disease for people to understand, particularly the relapsing remitting part, because often an NDIA, a LAC or a planner will hear relapsing remitting and they maybe think of cancer perhaps and they say, oh, well, you're in remission now, so you're cured, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
And you're not. It's just that you're in between exacerbations, so something could go wrong at any minute. So we're very keen on, for example, the NDIA revisiting their early intervention guidelines.
Absolutely.
Because our belief is that if you get all the, say it's accommodation, if you get the right place set up for yourself early on from day one, then you don't need to keep retrofitting and fixing things. You need less support later if you can get initial support set up. If you can get your home office set up, you can stay at work for longer.
Yeah.
If you've got MS, for example.
Thank you. And it really sounds that what you're doing at MS Australia is really important work, really educating the NDIA, spreading more awareness and, changing people's lives. On that, so you mentioned about the suitable accommodation. So part of what we do here at NDIS Property Australia is have conversations like this to bridge the conversation gap and spread more awareness throughout the disability community. But of course, on the other end, we do specialize in NDIS property as well and building suitable solutions for, the disabled people of Australia. So when it comes to somebody living with MS, for example, maybe someone who's wheelchair bound or maybe even someone who isn't wheelchair bound, what housing solutions do you see that would be able to support these people?
Sure. Well, at the risk of this podcast running for 3 hours, I'll just say a few things briefly that I'm sure you have all heard these before, but and many of you will be familiar with the work of MS Queensland and MS Western Australia, for example, and their various accommodation options. And our state services and support colleagues work with supported independent living and specialist disability accommodation. And, of course, our state colleagues are working beyond MS because to get economies of scale, they're looking after people who haven't just got MS, but they're trying to look after the motor neurone community and the Huntington's community, etc. So, and we are, as a peak body, also in fact, we lead the Neurological Alliance. So we try to go beyond MS because 25,600, I know it sounds like a lot of people and it's a lot of people's lives, but of course, compared to other conditions in Australia, like dementia, like, coronary heart disease, perhaps like asthma, we know we're a little bit further down the priority list in terms of national health priorities. So we need every accommodation option we can get. Mm-hmm. So at the moment, we're interested this week that the Summer Foundation, who's a group of people very keen to get young people out of nursing homes. Mm-hmm. So we're very interested to support, and we work on various projects with the Summer Foundation. And that is about, at the moment, their campaign is, and they've put in a big pre-budget submission to the federal government, getting people who have gone into hospital, out of hospital as part of their aftercare plan and into appropriate accommodation by activating the accommodation parts of their NDIS plan so that they don't end up in the default pathway, which is to the nursing home. Because you can imagine you're a younger person living in a nursing home or residential aged care, it's kind of miserable and can be miserable. And so we want people to have options. An issue that is often raised with me is people who are renting and in rental accommodation, it's often we don't have enough incentives for landlords to put in the ramps and rails, to adjust the bathrooms, because it's all about retrofitting. So what we also joined in the campaign to the Building Better Homes campaign, because we figure if there were some adjustments made to the national standards for building homes, that places would be built in the first instance. We'd like everything built to the platinum standard so that all the bathrooms have got turning ability, so that if you're in a wheelchair and you're visiting someone, you can get through the front door and say hi. So we'd like to see that. But I think a couple of the state governments are being a bit recalcitrant there in adopting those standards. And we understand all the costs, but we just kind of figure there is some standards there that a rich nation like Australia should be able to adopt. And the biggest thing for us, of course, is choice, because I don't have MS and I can choose to live where I like. But for people who have got limited choices, we still want those folks to have choice. So whether it's living at home, with family, with the right bed and the right bathroom and the right kitchen, that would be terrific. We know of people who can't live. I know of a chap in Tasmania who can't live with his family at the moment because the family home, it will cost too much to have it altered. So we want those people to have some choice about living at home with services or living with family. There are still some people, particularly older middle-aged people, maybe I would say in their 50s, who are living in residential aged care, but they're living near their family and friends, and they're able to have visits, and they feel very secure because of all the services that are coming to them. So it's not up to me to say whether their life is miserable or not. I want people to be able to have some choice to live the best lives they can. Often it's harder for people in rural and regional communities, and I'm sure folks listening to this will be aware of the thin markets that exist the further you get away from the big metropolitan centres. So choice when you're living in a rural or regional or remote community, it gets harder and harder. And often people do have to move to metro areas away from family and friends just to get the right sort of accommodation to maintain independence. So that's a bit difficult, but and that's kind of life in Australia in a way, but we'd like to feel we were moving towards something a bit better than the current situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that. We did actually have somebody in yesterday, Kim from Inclusive Living, and she was talking about all the different inclusions that you can put in a property and why it's so important to increase the quality of life for these people. You know, it's amazing. So that's definitely something that we're going to be speaking to our investors about and explaining the differences and why it's so important. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you for clarifying that.
And one thing perhaps that I would just add to accommodation, I've fallen into the trap in explaining that to you a little bit in what people expect from disability, accessible accommodation. And that's the ramps and the rails, and we think of the physical stuff. People with MS are often unable to thermally regulate, so they often get very hot. Yeah. So one of the things that we like to see in NDIS packages, if at all possible, and people often just buy their own, is air conditioners. So everybody with MS needs an air conditioner. Some people also have the need for heating, but in general, most people with MS need cooling. And the further north you get, obviously, the more cooling. That then means that they get an air conditioner or a split system, as we call them here, and their power bills just go up astronomically. So they can access the various energy discounts you can get in each state. But we also need them to live in accommodation that's well insulated to try to keep their energy costs to a minimum. So once the room's cool, particularly the bedroom at night, it stays cool. So that's also very difficult for people in rental who often don't have good heating and cooling and often don't have good insulation. But that's a very important thing that is a bit MS specific compared to other disabilities or other health conditions.
Absolutely. Yeah, very important. Okay, so how can people get involved and help with what you're doing at MS Australia?
So the easiest way to get involved is just to keep an eye on our social media channels. So we're active on Facebook and Twitter. So if you like us on our social media channels and get involved in the conversation, if there's something that we put up that you don't like, we love people to tell us. We love people to send us messages. Say, no, you got that wrong. Or I wish you'd do a bit more. I often want to say to people with MS, we need a suggestion box that says, why don't they ... Why don't they look at this or fix that? A lot of people do, and we love that. Occasionally we will be writing submissions and we'll put the call out from us or from our state organisations. Tell us your story. Give us a case study.
Yeah.
We're involved in lots of alliances, Assistive Technology for All Alliance, the Accessible Product Design Alliance, the Neurological Alliance. We're all putting out social media messages, and we love to hear stories from people that really illustrates some good thing or difficulty that people are having, because it makes it real. And coming up very soon, we've got a federal election that'll be held sometime in May. And so in the next few weeks, we'll be launching our election commitments document, and we've identified 7 big issues that we want our next government, whoever may be in it, to address. And so we'll be looking for people to help us spread the word. We would never tell anyone how to vote, but we're keen for politicians to understand the needs of people living with MS and perhaps to sign up to make some adjustments to the NDIS or the aged care system or the health system. They're the 3 sectors we mostly are involved in, although I'm talking to you today kind of about accommodation, but I guess that would fall under, for us, that falls under the disability. But it could also fall under health, and it could also fall under aged care. So they all intersect. And so and keep an eye on our website. So we've joined our research and our advocacy websites together. And so there's always news items. There's ways there to get in touch with us. If people want more information or a new fact sheet, or there's something they can't find, info@msaustralia.org.au. We'll come back to you and we'll try to help.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
That's really good. I'm going to pop that all in the show notes. I'll pop your website, Twitter, your social media account. So anybody who wants to get involved with MS Australia, just head into the show notes and you'll be on your way. So, and Andrew, thank you so much for that. That was such an informative, important conversation. And I thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Great pleasure. Happy to be involved. And as I say, if there's any more information anyone needs, we've got fact sheets to burn. I'm sure we'll have something to help you, and if we haven't, we'll create it.
Amazing. That's so great. Thank you, Andrew.
Great.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please make sure that you are subscribed and following us so that you can keep in the loop with all of our upcoming episodes. We would really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star rating, a written review, and to share this episode with those that can benefit. Until next time, catch you on the next episode.